David had always believed that loyalty was rewarded, that years of dedication and sleepless nights meant something in a world driven by ambition and numbers. And for 7 long years, he poured his very soul into the company he called a second home. He was the first to arrive and the last to leave, the man who stayed behind to polish presentations, who covered for sick colleagues without complaint, who mentored fresh graduates until they became confident enough to stand on their own. And though his bank account wasn't overflowing, his heart carried the quiet pride of a man who had earned respect honestly. Yet beneath the polished floors and glowing company slogans, envy festered in the shadows, wearing the face of Marcus, a coworker whose charm was only a mask for insecurity, a man who wore expensive suits, but whose eyes always flickered with bitterness every time David was praised, because Marcus thrived not on hard work but on shortcuts, manipulation, and stealing credit where he could. Their rivalry was unspoken but sharp, Marcus smiling during meetings while secretly undermining David with whispered comments to management. He works hard, sure, but does he really deliver results? Until the seeds of doubt slowly began to take root. David, blind to the storm gathering around him, continued with his routines, unaware that every late-night file update and every extra hour of unpaid dedication was being twisted into a narrative that painted him not as a hero, but as a liability. And Marcus, ever patient, plotted with the precision of a predator circling prey, waiting for the moment when the trap would finally snap shut. That moment came when a high-profile client's project was approaching deadline, tension running high across the office, everyone scrambling to deliver perfection, and Marcus, with practiced subtlety, slipped confidential draft documents into David's shared folder, files David had never touched, files that seemed to suggest he had mishandled sensitive information. The following morning, David entered the office with his usual quiet determination, clutching a lukewarm coffee, unaware that eyes already followed him with suspicion, whispers already curling in corners like smoke. Then the call came. A sharp ring on his desk phone, the manager's voice cold and clipped. "David, step into my office now." His heartbeat quickened as he walked the long hallway, every step heavy, and when he entered, the room's atmosphere felt suffocating, the blinds drawn. His manager seated with a folder on the desk, lips pressed into a thin line. "David," the manager said without warmth, sliding the folder toward him, "we trusted you." And as David flipped it open, confusion flooded his face, because inside were the very documents Marcus had planted, stamped and marked in ways that suggested he had been careless or even deceitful. "This isn't mine," David stammered, his voice trembling, his palms sweating as he struggled to explain. "I would never. This must be a mistake." But the words fell like stones into an abyss, unheard, unwanted, because the verdict had already been written. Management saw only betrayal, not loyalty, only evidence, not explanations. And in the cold efficiency of corporate justice, the sentence was swift, termination effective immediately. The humiliation was unbearable as HR entered with clipped instructions as security arrived to escort him, as colleagues peeked over cubicles with a mixture of pity and relief that it wasn't them. David gathered his belongings into a cardboard box, the framed photo of his late father, who always told him to work hard and you'll be respected, the pens he had bought with his own money because the company never stocked enough, the coffee mug gifted by interns he once mentored, and as he walked through the aisles one last time, silence pressed heavy, punctuated only by the muffled sound of typing and the occasional cough, until his eyes caught movement in the corner. Marcus, leaning casually against the wall, his lips curled into a smirk so slight yet so venomous that it etched itself permanently into David's memory, a smirk that said, "I won," without a word spoken. In that moment, betrayal stabbed deeper than any blade. Rage coursed hotter than any fire, and humiliation clung heavier than chains, because in a single day, 7 years of loyalty had been erased, replaced with suspicion and disgrace, leaving David not just unemployed, but shattered, carrying not just a box of belongings, but the weight of injustice. And as the office doors closed behind him with a metallic thud, the world outside felt colder, harsher, emptier, yet within the storm of pain a spark ignited, the beginning of something darker, sharper, A vow that one day Marcus would pay for turning loyalty into a weapon and trust into a noose. The weeks after David's firing felt like a long descent into darkness, each day stretching into an eternity of silence and shame. His once orderly apartment now littered with unopened bills and cold cups of coffee, his mornings spent staring at the ceiling, replaying the humiliation in the manager's office, the whispers of co-workers, the sound of his own voice breaking as he insisted, "This isn't mine," yet knowing no one believed him. And in the stillness of those days, bitterness threatened to consume him whole, until one evening, staring at the box of belongings from his desk, the photo of his father, the intern's coffee mug, the meaningless trinkets of a career abruptly erased, something hardened inside him, a realization that while Marcus had stolen his reputation, he had not stolen his will, and with clenched fists David whispered to the empty room, "He took everything from me, but I won't stay broken." From that moment, grief gave way to resolve, and David began the slow, grueling climb back from ruin, first by forcing himself into routine, early mornings, strict schedules, hours spent sharpening skills he once took for granted, relearning industry trends, mastering new technologies, and rebuilding the confidence that betrayal had shattered. He reached out quietly to old clients, those who remembered his dedication, offering freelance work at a fraction of his worth just to prove himself again. And slowly, word began to spread. David was reliable. David was thorough. David was not the man the rumors painted him to be. His calendar filled with small projects, then larger ones. His nights consumed not by restless anger, but by spreadsheets, presentations, and the hum of late-night determination, until within months his income stabilized, modest, but enough to keep the lights on, and more importantly, his name began to regain weight in circles outside the company that had cast him aside. Yet for all the progress, a shadow lingered, because success alone could not erase the image of Marcus's smirk, that cruel twist of lips that mocked David's downfall. And though many told him to let go, to move on, David knew in his bones that he could not truly rise until he had confronted the man who framed him. Revenge was not a distraction. It was closure, it was justice. And as the thought grew sharper, he began to watch Marcus from afar, tracking his moves through industry newsletters, social media posts, and whispers from contacts. Marcus, as expected, had thrived after David's departure, climbing ranks quickly, taking credit for projects David had once laid the groundwork for, boasting about achievements that weren't his, and flaunting a lifestyle of arrogance built on deceit. David's anger matured into focus, and instead of rashly lashing out, he planned meticulously, gathering scraps of information like a hunter studying prey. Old colleagues complained quietly about Marcus's temper. Clients hinted at shady dealings. And through back channels, David discovered that Marcus's careless arrogance had left trails, emails forwarded sloppily, receipts hidden poorly, and whispers of bribes offered to secure contracts. Night after night, David pieced the puzzle together. His small apartment now transformed into a war room, walls lined with notes, connections drawn in red ink, folders filled with evidence carefully organized, until it became clear that Marcus was not simply corrupt. He was reckless, and recklessness left cracks wide enough for truth to slip through. One night, exhausted but exhilarated, David leaned back in his chair, staring at the web of papers pinned to his wall, and for the first time in months, a genuine smile crept onto his face. The smile of a man no longer crushed under betrayal, but empowered by it, the smile of someone who realized he held the weapon Marcus never expected: truth. The irony struck him deeply. Marcus had destroyed him with lies, but David would destroy Marcus with the truth, not in whispers or shadows, but publicly, decisively, leaving no room for doubt. And though the road ahead promised danger, David welcomed it, because this was no longer about survival, it was about justice, about reclaiming his dignity, about ensuring that the man who once smirked at his downfall would one day taste the bitter humiliation of losing everything. And as David switched off the lamp that night, his war room glowing faintly in the dark, he whispered the vow that would guide every step forward. Marcus will pay, and when he does, he will know it was me who brought him down. A year had passed since David's life had been ripped apart. A year of grinding days and sleepless nights, spent clawing his way back from the pit Marcus had pushed him into. And though David had rebuilt his career piece by piece, establishing himself as a trusted freelancer with a growing network of loyal clients, he knew that his journey was not complete, for success was sweet, but it could not erase the memory of walking out of that office with a cardboard box in his arms while Marcus smirked like a man who had claimed victory. And so David waited, patient as a predator, watching Marcus's rise from the shadows, knowing that arrogance always makes men sloppy. When the prestigious annual client gala was announced, David recognized his opportunity, for this was not just another networking event, it was the crown jewel of the company's calendar, where executives, clients, and competitors gathered under one roof where reputations could be forged or destroyed in an instant. And it was here, in the glittering halls of chandeliers and champagne glasses, that Marcus would finally meet the weight of the truth he had so long evaded. That evening, Marcus arrived dressed like a king, his tailored suit glinting under the golden lights, his voice booming as he greeted clients with over-practiced charm, his laughter echoing too loud, too forced, and though he carried himself with swagger, there was an undercurrent of desperation in his manner. For Marcus had built his empire not on hard work, but on deceit, and deep down, perhaps he sensed that empires built on lies eventually crumble. As he mingled, unaware of what awaited, David slipped quietly into the back of the hall, unseen, unnoticed, his presence a ghost from the past, but his heart pounding with the steady rhythm of justice approaching. The evening unfolded with speeches, and presentations, glasses clinking, polite applause echoing across the room, until the CEO himself stood at the podium, a grave expression replacing the usual rehearsed charm, and the sudden silence that spread across the hall felt like a storm, breaking. "Ladies and gentlemen," the CEO began, his voice heavy, "before we continue with tonight's program, it has come to our attention that certain irregularities have surfaced in our operations, irregularities that cannot be ignored." Murmurs rippled through the crowd, confusion etched on every face, but none more so than Marcus's, whose smile faltered for the first time all evening, his hand tightening around his glass, as if to steady himself. "An independent audit was commissioned," the CEO continued, his eyes sweeping the room, "sponsored by a former employee who believed the truth deserved to be heard." And in that instant, Marcus's skin drained of color, because he knew exactly who that former employee was, and his gaze flickered desperately toward the back of the hall, searching. But David remained cloaked in the shadows, his silence more powerful than any confrontation. Then the screen behind the podium lit up, and the evidence David had spent months collecting blazed before the entire audience. Screenshots of falsified reports Marcus had submitted, emails revealing bribes offered in exchange for contracts, timestamps showing how confidential documents had been planted to frame David, each image a nail hammered into the coffin of Marcus's reputation. Gasps filled the room, whispers rising into shouts, and Marcus stood frozen, his arrogance stripped away, his body trembling as sweat beaded on his forehead, his mouth opening and closing, but no words escaping. The CEO turned toward him, voice cutting through the chaos. "Marcus, is this true?" The silence that followed was unbearable. Every eye in the room fixed upon him, and Marcus, usually quick with lies, found himself stuttering, choking, unable to spin his web fast enough to ensnare the truth flashing across the screen. It's not what it looks like," he managed, but the words sounded hollow, laughable, and already the security team had moved in, stepping forward with grim expressions. The room seemed to close in on Marcus, as clients muttered in disgust. Executives exchanged furious glances, and the empire he had stolen crumbled around him in seconds, the weight of public disgrace crushing him more thoroughly than any private reprimand ever could. His protests turned into pleas, his bravado collapsing into pitiful whimpers as security seized his arms and marched him toward the exit, the same humiliating walk he had once forced David to endure. But this time, the shame was deserved, the whispers venomous, the laughter cruel. And in the back of the hall, David finally stepped into the dim light, just enough for Marcus to see him as he was dragged away, their eyes locking for a fleeting electric moment. David's lips curled into a smirk, the same smirk Marcus had Once worn when David's world crumbled, but this time it was not born of malice. It was born of victory, of justice, of the sweet satisfaction of watching betrayal undone by truth. Marcus's face twisted with recognition, fury and fear mingling as realization struck. The man he had destroyed had returned, stronger, sharper, and it was his hand that had pulled the strings of Marcus's downfall. The doors slammed behind. Marcus, the echoes reverberating through the hall like the final toll of a bell. And in that silence, David felt a weight lift from his chest. The chains of humiliation shattered, the ghost of betrayal finally exorcised. For the first time in over a year, David stood tall not as a victim, but as a man who had risen from ruin to reclaim his dignity, and as he turned to leave the hall, slipping once more into the shadows, a quiet thought lingered in his mind, one that would resonate with anyone who had ever been wronged. Betrayal may break a loyal heart, but revenge, precise and just, makes it whole again.